Something strange happened this year, and almost nobody noticed it. Not because it was hidden behind passwords or locked doors, but because everyone was looking somewhere else. At the end of January, gold and silver crashed hard. Screens were red. Social media was loud. People argued over charts, over targets, over who was right and who was wrong. And while all that noise was happening, the US government quietly uploaded millions of pages of old documents to a public website. No announcement, no headline, just files. Most people scrolled right past it. Inside those documents was an old email from 2011 that mentioned Fort Knox and America's gold. Not proof of anything, not a smoking gun, just a reference that reopened a question most people assume was already answered. Is the gold actually verified? That question alone is enough to change how people think. Now let me slow this down, because this is where things usually go off the rails online, and I'm not going there. This is not about secret plots. This is not about claiming the gold is missing. And this is not about taking one document and turning it into a conclusion. The email doesn't prove anything. What matters is what it points toward. A long trail of unanswered questions that are already on the public record. Here's the first one. When was the last full, independent audit of America's gold reserves? Not a visit, not a photo, not a statement. An actual audit. The answer is the early 1950s. That's over 70 years ago. Think about how much has changed since then. Entire financial systems have come and gone. Currencies have been created and abandoned. Wars have been fought. Technology has reshaped the world. And yet, the largest gold reserve on Earth hasn't had a modern, transparent audit in all that time. That's not speculation. That's history. There have been partial inspections. Officials have looked at sealed rooms. Cameras have shown stacks of bars. But no full public accounting. No independent verification using modern methods. No detailed report released to citizens. Instead, the public is told the gold is there. Trust us. Trust is fine. But trust without verification doesn't age well, especially in a world where money itself is changing. Now let's talk about something else that's real and documented. Other countries have asked for their gold back. Germany did. They requested a portion of their reserves that were stored abroad. This wasn't hostile. It wasn't dramatic. It was a formal request between allies. And yet, it took years. Not because planes were unavailable, not because paperwork was slow, but because the process was complicated. When the gold finally arrived, it had been melted down and recast. Officials said this was standard practice. Critics asked why it was necessary. Again, no accusation is required to find that odd, just curiosity. Now fast forward to recent years. Public figures openly talked about verifying Fort Knox, about transparency, about showing the public what's inside. These weren't anonymous voices. They were people with real authority. And then the conversation stopped. No inspection, no audit, no follow-up, just silence. Silence doesn't prove anything is wrong, but silence does create uncertainty. And uncertainty is powerful because markets don't need certainty to move. They move on probabilities. If there's even a small chance that something isn't fully accounted for, people adjust. Not dramatically, quietly. They buy a little gold. They reduce exposure elsewhere. They diversify. Those small actions add up. That's how demand grows without panic. Now here's where this ties directly into price. Gold isn't just another asset. It's a reference point. It sits outside the system while also supporting it. Governments hold it. Central banks hold it. Institutions respect it. And right now, governments are carrying massive debt. That matters, because gold on official books is still valued at a price set decades ago, far below today's market value. That means hundreds of billions of dollars exist on balance sheets, but aren't reflected properly. Revaluing gold upward wouldn't require raising taxes. It wouldn't require cutting spending. It wouldn't require passing controversial laws. It's an accounting adjustment. And that makes higher gold prices more acceptable than most people realize. This is where the story stops being emotional and becomes practical. A higher gold price helps balance sheets. It strengthens confidence. It supports currencies without printing more money. That doesn't mean anyone is manipulating the market upward. It means there's less incentive to fight the trend. Now add global behavior into the mix. Countries like China have been steadily increasing gold reserves. Not loudly, not suddenly, month after month. At the same time, they've reduced reliance on foreign debt and built alternative payment systems. That's not ideology. That's strategy. Gold is neutral. Gold doesn't depend on cooperation. Gold doesn't require permission. So when trust between systems becomes thinner, gold becomes more valuable by default. This is why the January crash didn't break the gold market. It flushed leverage. It scared short-term players. It reset positioning. And then buyers stepped back in. That's not what a dying market looks like. That's what a stressed market looks like that still has a strong foundation underneath. And here's the quiet truth most people miss. If everything were perfectly fine, transparency would be easy. An audit would calm nerves. A report would end speculation. A few cameras would shut down every rumor. The fact that this hasn't happened doesn't prove a problem, but it does keep the question alive. And as long as the question is alive, gold keeps its role. Not as a trade, not as a hype story, but as insurance. That's why gold doesn't need dramatic headlines to move higher over time. It just needs uncertainty to linger. And right now, uncertainty isn't going anywhere. Now let's talk about behavior, because behavior tells the truth long before headlines do. If you want to understand where gold is headed, don't listen to predictions. Watch who is buying it and why. Central banks are not emotional traders. They don't chase candles. They don't panic sell. They operate on long timelines, and they care about stability above everything else. And over the past few years, their behavior has been very clear. They are buying gold, not in a dramatic rush, not in a way that grabs attention, just steady accumulation, month after month. That alone should make you pause. Because central banks don't buy things unless they believe those things will matter in the future. They're not trying to flip gold next quarter. They're positioning for the next decade. Why would they do that? Because the world is changing in ways that don't show up cleanly on a price chart. Debt levels are rising everywhere, not just in one country. Globally, interest costs are climbing. Political cycles are getting shorter. Trust between nations is thinner than it used to be. In that environment, holding something that doesn't depend on another country's promise becomes more attractive. Gold fits that role perfectly. It doesn't default. It doesn't get sanctioned. It doesn't rely on a payment network staying friendly. That's why countries that disagree on almost everything else still agree on holding gold. Now think about how that connects to the Fort Knox question. If gold reserves are unquestionably solid, then gold is simply a neutral asset, important but calm. If reserves are unquestioned but not verified, gold becomes something else. It becomes a hedge against uncertainty itself. And uncertainty doesn't need proof. It just needs silence. That's why the lack of transparency matters more than any document or rumor. The longer the question goes unanswered, the more valuable gold becomes as reassurance. Now here's something else that rarely gets discussed. Gold prices don't need retail investors to explode upward. Retail attention comes late. It always has. The biggest moves happen when institutional demand quietly overwhelms supply, when flows change at the margin. Gold is a relatively small market compared to global financial assets. Even small reallocations can have big effects. If just a few % of global reserves shift toward gold, prices adjust dramatically. Not because gold became rarer overnight, but because demand rose in a market that doesn't scale quickly. That's why price targets that sound extreme today often look reasonable in hindsight. Now let's talk about the January crash again, but from a different angle. People saw it as failure, as proof that gold was overhyped, as a warning sign. But crashes don't always mean rejection. Sometimes they mean reset. Gold didn't collapse because its long-term role disappeared. It fell because leverage was flushed out of the system. When margin rules tighten and volatility spikes, forced selling happens. Not because sellers want to exit, but because they have no choice. That kind of selling is temporary by nature. Once it ends, what remains is the real market. The buyers who aren't leveraged. The holders who don't need to sell. That's why the rebound mattered. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't gentle. But it was fast. That tells you demand didn't vanish. Now let's connect this back to government incentives, because this is where the story becomes quietly powerful. Governments benefit from stable systems. They benefit from confidence. And in a world of heavy debt, they benefit from assets that strengthen balance sheets. Gold does that. A higher gold price makes reserves more valuable. It supports currencies indirectly. It improves optics without requiring hard policy choices. That doesn't mean governments control gold prices. It means they don't mind the direction. There's a difference between pushing something and allowing it. Now zoom out even further. Other countries are watching the same dynamics. If one nation's gold reserves are unquestioned, but another's are verified and growing, trust shifts. That's why gold accumulation is competitive without being confrontational. Nobody announces it as a challenge. They just buy. This is why the story doesn't hinge on proving anything dramatic. Gold doesn't need a scandal to go higher. It just needs the world to remain uncertain. And let's be honest, uncertainty isn't fading. Technology is changing labor. Energy systems are being rebuilt. Trade relationships are being renegotiated. Currencies are under pressure. In that environment, gold doesn't need to be exciting. It just needs to exist. Now I want to address something important for anyone watching this. This is not about rushing out and doing anything drastic. It's about understanding the environment you're in. If you see gold as a short-term trade, this market will frustrate you. It will spike and drop and make no sense. If you see gold as a long-term stabilizer, the noise matters less. That's why people talk past each other about gold all the time. They're using different time horizons. The January crash scared short-term players. It didn't scare central banks. That tells you everything. And here's one last thing I want you to think about before we close this out. If the gold is there, transparency would strengthen confidence. If transparency is avoided, confidence erodes slowly. Slow erosion is invisible day to day, but powerful over time. And markets are very good at pricing slow erosion. That's why gold doesn't need urgency to rise. It benefits from patience. It rises while people argue. It rises while questions linger. It rises while trust quietly shifts. And that's why this story isn't going away. Now let's bring this home, because this story isn't really about vaults or headlines or even price targets. It's about trust. Every financial system runs on trust. Trust that numbers are real. Trust that promises will be honored. Trust that when someone says this is backed, it actually is. Most of the time, that trust works quietly in the background. Nobody questions it. Nobody needs to. But when stress enters the system, people start asking questions they never cared about before. That's what we're seeing now. Not panic, curiosity. And curiosity is dangerous to fragile systems. When people ask, is the gold there? They're not really asking about metal. They're asking whether the foundations still matter. And when that question isn't answered clearly, people start making their own decisions. They don't wait for confirmation. They don't wait for audits. They just adjust behavior. That's how capital moves. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Quietly. Gold doesn't surge because everyone suddenly agrees. It rises because enough people stop arguing and start hedging. Now think about how this plays out from here. If nothing happens, if no audit ever comes, if silence continues, the uncertainty stays alive. And uncertainty favors gold. If an audit happens and everything is perfect, confidence improves, but gold doesn't collapse. Because the world is still carrying massive debt and structural tension. If an audit happens and issues are found, even small ones, confidence shifts immediately, and gold reacts violently. Notice something important. In every scenario, gold survives. That's why central banks hold it. That's why long-term allocators don't trade it emotionally. That's why price crashes don't end the story. They just change who holds it. Now let's talk about why so many people misunderstand moments like this. Most people are trained to think in headlines. Up equals good, down equals bad, crash equals failure. But markets don't work that way. Big moves often happen when narratives break, not when they're confirmed. The January crash wasn't the end of belief in gold. It was the end of complacency. And that's healthy. Healthy systems survive stress. Fragile systems hide from it. Gold has been stress tested for thousands of years. Currencies haven't. That doesn't mean currencies disappear. It means they fluctuate. They change. They get managed. Gold just sits there. That's its strength. Now, let me be very clear, because this matters. This is not a call to fear. It's the opposite. Fear makes people rush. Understanding makes people patient. If you understand why gold exists in the system, you don't need it to perform every week. You don't need it to hit a number by Friday. You just need it to be there when things get noisy. That's why people who truly understand gold don't talk about it loudly. They accumulate quietly. They don't argue on social media. They don't need validation. They're not trying to be right today. They're trying to be positioned tomorrow. And that's the mindset difference that separates stress from calm. Now, here's what I want you to watch going forward. not predictions. Signals. Watch central bank behavior, not commentary. Watch whether gold dips get absorbed quickly. Watch whether price volatility scares long-term buyers or attracts them. Watch whether transparency increases or questions get ignored. Those things matter more than any single candle on a chart. And finally, ask yourself something honest. If gold was irrelevant, nobody would care whether it was audited. If gold didn't matter, nobody would debate it. If gold wasn't powerful, silence wouldn't be uncomfortable. The fact that this conversation even exists tells you gold still matters. Now I want to hear from you. Not what you think will happen to price next week, but this. Do you think trust in financial systems is strengthening or quietly thinning? Drop your answer in the comments. Yes or no, strengthening or thinning? That question matters far more than any chart. If this video helped you think more clearly, share it with one person who doesn't usually question these things. And if you want to stay ahead of narratives instead of reacting to them, subscribe. That's what this channel is for. Not hype, not fear, just clarity when things get loud.